Hello, and welcome back to Civic St. Ed with Johnny and Josh. I'm Johnny. How you doing, Josh?
Doing all right.
All right, good to hear it. Josh is coming to us from Southern California, LA. That's going to be relevant to this episode. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that coming up. So tonight's topic, we're talking about media. And we're talking about different ways we consume media, right? We kind of teased this last time when we were talking about postmodernism and kind of what is truth. Well, obviously, media and news consumption tie directly into that story of what truth is. And so, as we kind of previewed it last time, the way I'm thinking about this, the way Josh has been thinking about it, we kind of consume news, Josh, in three different ways, right? So mainstream, or what now we call legacy media sometimes. Those are the news networks we'll talk about. Independent or alternative new media, things like this podcast technically would fall in that category. And then social media, right? The Facebook, the Instagram, the X, the Blue Sky, whatever you use as a social platform. And the interesting thing that I just read the other day in the BBC that'll get us started tonight is that the BBC now suggests the data from the United States is that the majority of Americans now consume their news primarily through their social media feeds. So it's not that they're turning on Fox News or CNN. They're not opening the Wall Street Journal, paper, or they're not pulling up the New York Times website. They're getting it in little clips from social media, whether that's X or Truth Social or Blue Sky or Facebook or Instagram. And so that is clearly a sea change in the way we get our news. And so in that sense, I think tonight it's kind of an important topic to talk about how we consume that media and what the different forms of media are and why this new social media news consumption might have gotten us to this point. I don't know.
Yeah, I think talking about screens is definitely true, and each of us is going to have our own kind of little medley of sources and news outlets that we rely on a daily basis. But by and large, I'm guessing most people, as you're probably watching us talk right now, are getting their information from a screen of some sorts, whether it be a TV or a smartphone or a computer. There's a scholar, Timothy Snyder, that we're both big fans of. He talks about this. He's speaking in terms of television, but it's relevant for any type of screen. He says in his little political pamphlet on tyranny, on page 60, television purports to challenge political language by conveying images, but the succession from one frame to another can hinder a sense of resolution. Everything happens fast, but nothing actually happens. Each story on televised news is quote-unquote breaking until it's displaced by the next one. So we are hit by wave upon wave, but never see the ocean. And I think that's, you mentioned there's a sea change, right? Like, I'm sure you weren't intending that pun, but it is like very much, if you've ever been caught in kind of like a riptide or like, getting hit by waves, you're completely disoriented about your surroundings and what's going on and how to get out of it, right? And that's the real fear. And I think all of us, to varying extents, feel that way about just American politics and news consumption, where we're completely overstimulated with information. And it's ironic in that you'd think that it would help clear things up and make things make more sense, but it actually has the opposite effect of blurring and confusing and disorienting a lot of what's going on.
There's a good article the other day in the Atlantic by Charlie Warzel talking about media coverage of LA, which we're going to get into. And the quote that stuck with me there is, information is abundant, yet consensus is elusive, right? So the idea that we almost have too much information to make sense of. So our bodies and our minds, right, as we're receiving all this breaking news, we're almost like deregulated, right, in the way that we, because there is no resolution, there is no way of resolving all of these news stories or finding a solution to these things, and so it's always like you're waiting for the next shoe to drop. Like what's happening in LA today? What's happening in Tehran? What's happening in Gaza? What's happening at the G7 summit? Right? What's happening in Ukraine? You can come up with all these different scenarios, and get stuck sitting there refreshing your BBC feed, just waiting for the next crisis to unleash. And I find myself getting stuck in that trap sometimes, and it's tricky because even while all these images are bombarding us, everyone is seeing different images, and everyone is seeing potentially the images they want to see, right, from these different news cycles. And because Josh, you're in LA, and because at the time of this recording, LA is quiet now, but last week it was the site of military deployments and so-called riots and protests. Not to mention the ICE raids that preceded it. You know, give us the sense on the ground as an LA resident. What an Angelino. Um, what was it like? Was it like what was being covered? What's your take from there?
Yeah, I mean, the amount of ways in which I could answer this with some sort of sarcasm is overwhelming. But I guess one way of putting it would be you could have pretty much been in 99.9% of the greater Los Angeles region, and if your head was buried in the sand, you wouldn't have known anything was happening.
Yeah,
Um, it was business as usual throughout almost all of the region, except for a couple streets in one or two places downtown and in Paramount. Um, that being said, like what's happening is serious and affecting a lot of people, and it would be kind of very privileged to be like, well, nothing's really happening. I mean, stuff is definitely happening, right?
hmm?
But this picture that's painted in the media that LA is burning is just, it would be hilarious if it wasn't so insultingly untrue.
Yeah,
And that's just what it is. It's just not true. Um,
yeah,
there's a number of, well, just false premises on which this picture is being painted. Um, one being kind of the false accusation that all undocumented immigrants are criminals. Um, it's just not true. And they're not targeting just criminals. They're targeting everyday people,
yeah.
workers,
Anyone who
and
looks
families.
undocumented. Yeah,
Yeah. Building on that, the administration is grossly exaggerating the scope and the nature of the anti-ICE protests.
yeah,
Um, again, like this isn't. I mean, I was here for the George Floyd protests. Those were pretty intense.
yeah.
This is like not even a fraction of what that was.
Sure.
Um, it's it's so contained to a couple streets, and yet the media and well, Fox News would have you believe it's everywhere and the whole city's burning.
Right.
And then the last thing is that there's this conflation of peaceful protesters with insurrectionists, right? Which is
Yes.
the most insulting given what we know
Yes.
about Trump's pardons.
It's
Um, so yeah, of course, there's been some bad actors, and those bad actors have given the administration the what, two or three uh, clips that they need to put on Fox News on repeat again and again and again. It's the same videos: the Waymo cars burning,
yeah.
protesters throwing rocks from the freeway overpass, um, and some combination of a Mexican flag
And
in a
fire.
smoggy environment. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, and that's it, right? And those three images or those three clips or whatever are then meant to represent what has been vastly a peaceful uh, process of protesting, right?
Well, Yeah, and a protest against, if they're not protesting just randomly, it's a protest against a pretty heavy-handed, you know, implementation of ICE in a clearly um, curated location of LA, right? I was reading some statistics, right? Like California has a large undocumented population, but no larger than Florida or Texas. Um, but they're not coming into red states to do this, right? There's a message to send in LA that, of course, set up, and we don't have to get into all this, but set up the kind of war of words between Gavin Newsom and Trump, set up the incredible scenes between Kristi Noem and members of senators, Padilla, who were just asking questions and getting tackled for doing so. And so there is, all of those images are meant to convey a certain, Trump as law and order president coming in, stamping down on California's hubris and as Trump says it, like you could either, in various iterations, rounding up these animals or liberating the city from these people, right? So I'm glad
Yeah,
you're liberated now, Josh.
yeah,
Sarcasm
me
meant.
too. I mean, just like we were all burning before he turned the faucets on in Northern California. I mean, the gratitude I have is so abundant it cannot be described in words. But
um,
like this all is, it is. I know this is just one media story, and we're going to talk about media more generally. But
yeah,
this is just a classic suppression tactic of authoritarian movements, right? To
yes,
delegitimize opposition and to delegitimize protests by painting the entire thing as violent.
yeah,
Um, it's so abundantly clear if you know how these things work. The evidence is all right in front of us.
yeah,
Um, and yet, when people are getting this story filtered through the lens of a place like Fox News, they're going to understandably be calling and saying, "Hey, are you okay?"
hmm yeah. I'm
Why,
sure
why?
you had people reach out to you. Yeah.
Some, but less so than the wildfires.
Oh,
And yeah,
interesting. Okay.
yeah,
Yeah.
which was a
Um,
big deal, which was pretty scary.
yeah. Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, moving beyond um, the LA issue from last week, right? We also had the No Kings um, rallies, and these were peaceful protest rallies organized to coincide with Trump's military parade all across the country that happened this past Saturday. So I was intrigued at the end of the night because it was a day of some nervousness for me, thinking about all the violence that could potentially play out. And as we know, there was a shooting in Utah. There was a Minnesota lawmaker who was assassinated. Like there was violence, but not as much as there could have been. So I was just curious at the end of the night, Saturday. I scrolled through NPR, BBC, New York Times, Wall Street Journal, even things like the Spectator and the National Review to see kind of how they had covered these No Kings protests all around the country, and all of those seem to imply that these were largely peaceful, right? And it was almost like a sigh of relief, if not celebratory. So some of the more what people would say left leaning news outlets had lots of great images of people, draped in American flag, saying the Pledge of Allegiance, all that kind of stuff. Even the ones that would be more conservative on that end, um, you know, at least kind of admitted that these were peaceful. Except then I opened Fox News on a website, right? So the main page of Fox News on Saturday night, then the number one headline, even taking the spot away from Trump's parade, said four injured in Portland riot against ICE, right? Um, and that was the image you were supposed to see when you opened the app, right? Um, and that was the takeaway from the No Kings protests of the day. If you tuned into Fox News and didn't scroll down from there, um, and so it was kind of a wake up moment for me. I don't typically open up the Fox News website too often, but to see all these other outlets saying this one thing, right, and then Fox News, which has maybe the largest viewership in the country of
Oh yeah,
legacy media,
Yeah.
saying a totally different thing and saying exactly what you probably would expect to see when you opened up that, if you're a Fox News aficionado, and confirming all of the things you were already thinking about these protests. That, there's a reason we're as divided as we are as a country.
Yeah, like, look, any violence is bad, but I don't know what the official numbers are. I've heard upwards of 12 to 13 million people,
Hmm.
and with the No Kings protest being the largest protest in American history, right?
That's
Um,
cool. I didn't
the
see that. That's cool.
the lack of violence overall. I mean, 12 to 13 million people, or even shave a couple million off it. Like,
Yeah, I saw
um,
I saw 8 or 9, right? But yeah,
yeah,
either
but like
way,
either way, like there was no large scale violence at all. Um, and I mean, Elizabeth and I both went to different ones here. There's like 40 different ones across Southern California. And they were staggered, so we could each babysit, and that
nice.
was the most optimistic I felt about the the, the path we're on as a country since all this started. Um, the numbers are, I mean, just the positivity, the concerted nature of everyone who's there, and just the overwhelming numbers. I mean, I was in Pasadena, and I think the city came out and said 4,000, and I don't know how to count crowds at all, but it
Yeah.
felt like more than 4,000. It really did.
Okay. Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. I mean, even in West Texas, there were good showings. I will say I was also encouraged by how, you know, and this is me as a recovering middle of the road slash conservative leaning guy from rural Ohio, but like they were patriotic, right? Like
oh yeah,
people were literally waving flags and holding signs about George Washington, Abe Lincoln, civil rights. Like this
oh
was
yeah,
not an anti-American riot. This was a extremely democratic little d constitution loving gathering, right?
oh
Across the
no, I
whole
mean
country.
the diversity of the people there was incredible. The amount of military veterans, uh, and just old people in general, and young people. I mean, the age, the diversity in age, was something that really caught me off guard. The amount of like just old white guys. You think like, oh, these are just probably Trumpers. Yeah. No, man, they were like the most vocal a lot of times, um, which was cool to see.
Yeah.
It really was. But yeah, like compare that
But
to the photoshopping of the crowds standing around the Washington Monument,
right.
in D.C. And
Yes.
I think if historians look back on that weekend and call it some sort of cultural battle of some sorts, it's pretty clear the No Kings protests were in a league of their own.
Yeah. Yeah. But, you would have been totally blind to that if you stayed in your tunnel of media coverage, right? Which is kind of the point of what we're talking about tonight. That, you wouldn't see the good or the bad or the ugly if you just tuned into what you wanted to hear from one outlet. I didn't bother to check Newsmax, I'll say. I'm sure they had some even better stuff.
Yeah, we
uh,
got to keep our mental health somehow, someday.
that's right. That's right. Okay, so let's talk about the three different versions of that because we were already kind of hinting at that with my anecdote there, right? But you mentioned Fox News. I mentioned CNN. Mainstream legacy media, whether we're talking journalism in print or on the TV, um, that's one of the three main categories. And up until recently, I'd say that's the main category of news consumption that most Americans would be familiar with. Now it's kind of the the news of our parents' generation. I think it's safe to say, but even that generation is much more tied to social media than ever before. So, tell me a few of the basics of legacy media. Just because I think it's important for us, if we're talking about media, it's important to know like what are the differences that set these media streams apart. Are there some that are more safe or responsible than others? who can we trust, right? Like what's it look like with mainstream media? Are they the ones we can trust, Josh?
That's a good question. Yes, I don't think there can ever be a world where the sort of legacy media of the CNNs and the Fox Newses and the MSNBCs go away. They're always going to have a role, and they're always going to have to be a part of, uh, just the functioning of a free society with free speech. So no, they're here to stay, and that's a good thing. Um, the baseline of these news outlets is supposed to be a journalistic integrity foundation, I guess you could say. There's a lot of work that's supposed to go into the production of news presented on these outlets. They have teams of journalists who travel, interview people, maintain relationships with various sources. There's research in the written records. Everything's supposed to be verified and vetted. We know
Right.
that's not true, but that's how it's supposed to work. And then in terms of putting on a show or like presenting the news, there's revising and editing, and all of this is done on incredibly tight schedules, right?
Right.
So when it's done right, it's one of the most important and noble professions we have as people.
Sure.
Our journalists are, the way we understand the world and understand what's going on around us.
The
Um,
fourth branch of government, as they're
yeah,
sometimes
exactly, or
called.
the fourth
Yeah.
estate.
Or
I
the
mean,
fourth estate. Yeah.
yeah, it's essential to a functioning of any civil society. So they're definitely here to stay. And I mean, a couple things historically have changed the way mainstream media functions. I mean, CNN does the first 24-hour news cycle in 1980. And certainly, if we're going to talk about images being repeated and repeated and repeated, the fact that they're expected to put out news 24 hours a day is going to play into that. Um, and then also, there's the repeal of what was called the Fairness Doctrine in 1987. This comes out of the post World War II era, and basically is the lay of the land through the 50s and 60s and 70s and much of the 80s, with the idea being that it's your responsibility as a news outlet to present two sides of the issue if it's a controversial issue, and to
Sure.
not sway too far one way or the other. It was your kind of your journalistic duty to present equally valid viewpoints to the best of your ability.
Sure. Yeah.
And
And a level of objectivity, right, is kind of the theory there.
yes,
To
and
some extent, yeah.
right, and this was, I mean, Congress in the 80s, was put through a bill to keep the Fairness Doctrine, vetoed by Reagan in 1987, and what you end up getting is a much more one-sided presentation of news on,
Yeah.
regardless of which side you tune into. Now today we have what you would call false equivalency, which is meant to look like that, where you get a talking head from one side of the issue and a talking head from another side, and they're given equal airtime. Yeah, that's not the same, but that's a topic for another time. But that's kind of the background of
Sure.
the news cycle today.
Yeah. Yeah. And these are, large corporations. They are profit-driven corporations. They're not, with the exception of like a public broadcasting service, they are not doing it just for the good of the people. They're making money off of this, lots of money. If you're a big CEO or owner of these legacy media corporations, um, and
Yeah.
so that of course brings in a factor of they want viewers, right? They want to be able to say they are the most watched news network in America. They want to be able to sell um, more money for ad time, on commercial breaks, and all of that kind of drives the model. Um, so they're not in it; they're in it for their own benefit as well. Yeah.
Yeah, and also just as an aside, I mean, what sells? Like, what do people tune in
Yeah.
for? Like, good
Right.
news of like things going normally? Like, no, like the anger. and the fear are the selling points. And it's not a coincidence that when you turn on any news outlet, really, but certainly Fox News, which caters to a right-wing audience, which has a platform that is predicated on resentment and anger and fear across the
Yeah.
board. I mean, I think even the most ardent Republican would tell you, yeah, what are their top hot button issues? It's like the fear of what immigration is doing to our country, the fear of what trans people are doing to our country.
Yeah.
Um, it's
Now,
just, yeah,
yeah. To be fair, I think MSNBC and to a lesser extent something like CNN makes a lot of money right now on fears of what Donald Trump's doing to the country too, right? And so
absolutely,
they
yeah,
are they're also fear mongers in a different context, right? The object of the fear is not a nameless migrant worker in California's Central Valley. It's the president of the United States, but it's still the same idea of like, I'm going to tune in to MSNBC to hear about how what terrible thing Donald Trump did or what executive order came out of the White House today, and then panic over whether that's going to affect you know society. So
and just,
yeah, it
I mean,
sells.
building on that point again, you mentioned they're all kind of corporate profit driven, and they are. One of the things that always strikes me as surprising is this refusal to kind of acknowledge that MSNBC, Fox News, CNN, ABC, they're all in that same corporate driven profit model of what we would say maybe oversimply is selling fear.
Sure.
Um, we have this image in our mind that there's Fox News on the right and then the left wing media, which is this container for all of the other ones. Uh, and certainly, like to a certain extent, in their coverage of Trump, you'd say, well, if Trump is the representation of the right, yeah, CNN and ABC and MSNBC are going to fall into that kind of anti-Trump camp. And my contention will be, well, that doesn't make them left wing. They're still very, very profit driven. They're still very, very much making their money. And I would say, all of them equally have a complicity in getting that guy elected again,
Yeah.
knowing he was a
Yeah.
convicted felon, and the number of felonies would have skyrocketed had he not been elected. Right?
Right.
There was
Yeah.
a real normalization of Trump as a candidate when there
Sure.
didn't need to be at
Yeah.
all, and other candidates could have been given more airtime, but Trump's stranglehold on the party was and remains so great. But these quote unquote left wing outlets, they
Yes.
knew deep down, hey, we're going to get viewers if Trump's elected again,
Yep.
and they sure are, right?
Right. Well, and there's a certain, this is Monday morning quarterbacking, but from 2021 to 2024, you know, um, part of Trump's rise back, if you will, right, comes from the media attention that he gets in that 3 year span. Um, which, I don't know how you avoid this if you're a journalist. He's almost too juicy to avoid in so many ways. Uh, he's outrage TV in personified, right? But they gave that flame oxygen by every time they made their breaking news about Trump or what Trump tweeted or what Trump said in court or what Trump was being charged with next. They fed the flames of that comeback, no matter what side of the aisle you want to put them on. And they all benefit, like you said, from this return of Trump because it's it's good, like it's good show business to put it one way. If we had had two boring candidates from the two parties, that wouldn't have caused the same stir. Um, so I think that's right.
Yeah. Um, all that being said, would you put? I mean, Fox News, right? Like the elephant in the room, figuratively and metaphorically, or same thing. But like, there is a real asymmetry, I think is the word to use, in
Yeah.
the spreading of fake news and disinformation. Um,
Yeah.
maybe fake news isn't quite the word I want to use there because that is kind of the smokescreen uh, coming out of the Trump campaign and Trump administration. But like one news outlet is way worse than the others, right?
Well, in terms of just peddling stories that they knew were false or know were false, right? I mean, there's a reason Tucker Carlson fell on his sword and got canned by Fox News because he kept promoting this conspiracy. I don't know what else you want to call it. Conspiracy about the 2020 election, um, and other conspiracies along the way. But Tucker Carlson's kind of his own kettle of fish. But in general, right? Fox News rolled out all of these, fringe theories about the 2020 election, about COVID before that, and gave it airtime and legitimacy in a way that other news outlets were not. You don't give legitimacy to nonsense, right? And that's where, going back to what you were talking about with the fairness doctrine, right? Just bringing some kook on to be the other voice in the room, that gives that kook airtime. It gives that kook legitimacy. That's a false equivalency from saying, well, we're fair and balanced, right? We're going to bring in both sides here. We're going to bring in a doctor, and we're going to bring in some crazy person who's been taking horse tranquilizers, whatever, right? Like, uh, I wish that wasn't made up, but so that is a problem, right? And Fox News was pretty shameless about doing it.
Shameless and ruthlessly efficient because it works.
Yeah,
Um,
sure.
I mean, the ultimate danger, right? Like this, it all kind of comes back to January 6th. It seems when we're talking about Trump, but you
Yeah,
don't get January 6th without the repeated amplification of what he was saying,
yeah,
which was that the election was stolen,
right.
right? And that's Fox News. That's on Fox News. I mean, it wasn't solely. There's Truth Social. There's the post, the tweets, or the
Yeah,
what are they? They're not called tweets on Truth. Whatever the posts. But
truths. They're called truths, ironically.
oh, right, yeah, okay. Of course. But like, you know, Fox ends up paying like what is it, $787.5 million in a defamation lawsuit against the Dominion voting machines. Um,
Yes, yes.
I'm assuming that's a lot of why Tucker got canned. I don't know
Yep.
exactly. I don't even know if he knows, but like you
I
don't.
don't know what Tucker knows, but
Um, you're not going to get that level of just disinformation from the other news outlets. Uh,
well,
they're not willing to debase themselves to quite the level Fox is.
and in that settlement, Josh, you maybe remember more of the details of this Dominion voting settlement stuff. But they essentially admitted they were not a news network, right?
There's
That's how they got out of the
Yeah, there's a couple different lawsuits where this comes up, where their
okay,
defense is, well, we're not a news outlet, we're
we're
just
entertainment.
providing opinions.
Right. Yeah.
I don't know exactly what the first lawsuit was. I mean, I have some text here from a district judge who gave an opinion in which Fox had the case dismissed successfully. And this is in regards to Tucker Carlson. I don't honestly, I do not know if this is related to the Dominion voting one or something separately, but the point is relevant either way. But the judge's opinion says, "quote The general tenor of the show should then inform a viewer that Carlson is not stating actual facts about the topics he discusses. It is instead engaging in exaggeration and, quote, non-literal commentary." The judge then goes on to say, Fox persuasively argues that given Mr. Carlson's reputation, any reasonable viewer arrives with an appropriate amount of skepticism about the statement he makes. which,
That
like,
is
yeah,
given a lot of credit to the American viewers, what I would say. Yeah. Yeah.
right. And so I think if you or I turned on Tucker or now Jesse Waters, we'd probably be laughing at how ridiculous what he's saying is. But there's a lot of like elderly people out there, and it was just like today, it was this morning, or maybe yesterday. Tucker Carlson was interviewing Steve Bannon. Ironically, now he's coming around and trashing Fox News, and this is, I mean, it's hilarious the relevancy of this. But he came out and said to Steve Bannon, like, Fox is just going full propaganda with Iran right now because they know they'll dupe all of the elderly Americans who tune in into
Yeah.
supporting another war, just like Iraq. Um,
Well, yeah, if you're one of the con men from the old circus, you know how the old circus works, right? Like that's how it goes.
yeah, yeah. But the thing about Tucker that's interesting is we know from this Dominion voting um, lawsuit that like he behind the scenes one hated Trump and was well aware of the fact that he was spewing BS
Right,
live on
right.
air. So is that
Yes.
worse or is it better? I don't know, but either way, it's pretty awful.
Yeah. Talk about a cynical dude. But I guess
But he dresses
you
nice, right?
it's where your bread gets buttered, exactly. Yeah. Okay. Yes. Well, anyway, yes. So Fox News stands out as the exception almost. We can critique all the legacy news outlets in one way or the other, but Fox's ability or willingness to peddle falsehoods and then settle in court over those falsehoods, essentially by their main defense being no one should take us seriously. That tells you something, right? But not every American is tuned into that or has the tools to sort through that uh, entertainment.
hmm
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's not to say Fox is the only news outlet facing lawsuits. Certainly, uh,
Right.
well, we know Trump loves to file them, and there's been a real concerted effort coming out of the administration to kind of quash opposition to what they're doing. And
Yeah.
if you're a traditional news outlet trying to hold the powers that be accountable, and you run into that, uh, it's going to present problems. So we've seen um, over the past few years, ABC, CBS, just to name two, that have settled lawsuits with the Trump team over things that are, uh, I guess, technically sensible, but kind of ridiculous and frivolous. One being, the ABC settlement of I think 15 million over George Stephanopoulos, or however Trump describes that name, uh, mentioning that he was found guilty of raping E. Jean Carroll, when according to the strict definition by New York law, he didn't rape her; he just sexually abused her. So that was
Oh.
15 minutes, 15 million towards his presidential library for that. And then more recently, CBS is they haven't even reached settlement yet, but there's another one in process over the edited Kamala Harris interview, which they,
Right.
they saved down to for time, and then the accusation was, well, you're changing the narrative, which of course they weren't, and they released the full video, and the meaning of what she said changed not an ounce, but I'm sure there'll be another couple million for that one.
Yeah. Well, and it just more recently, right? There's clearly an effort, even by. I mean, we've seen this with law firms since January. We've seen this with other elements of people kind of bending the knee and kissing the ring. Even what would be described as kind of mainstream or left leaning news outlets have clearly tried to kowtow towards Trump in some ways. So Terry Moran called Stephen Miller a class A hater or something, world class hater the other week, and got fired for it. And even he still won't rescind it, right? I saw he doubled down on being like, "Well, I said what I said. He is a world class hater," and that sounds like a compliment for Stephen Miller. But either
Yeah,
way, Terry Moran gets fired for this at ABC because he's bad mouthing the president and the president's boy, and that's wild, right? I mean, we could talk about like professional standards and things like that, but that seems to be a real clear example of the chilling self censorship that is coming out of even legacy news outlets now. And as going back to what you were saying earlier, the normalization of Trump 2.0 by even places like the New York Times or ABC, CNN, etc.
Yeah, I mean, I would say I am a bit surprised that it's probably ultimately a good thing, but the ethics of journalism, you would have thought could have gone out the window. Like if
Yeah,
the president of the United States is willing to throw every negative epithet at anyone he dislikes without
yeah,
any concern for
yeah,
uh, what's the word I'm looking, like decorum. These news outlets could have said, well, all right, hell with it, let's go to war, and give them a dose of their own medicine. But instead, yeah, you see Terry Moran getting fired.
yeah, yeah. Um, and yes, and a lot of good news outlets still trying to do good work in covering all that's going on in this administration and beyond. Right. So there's a lot of good journalists out there still doing very careful work, and we should be clear about that. Journalism has a methodology and a kind of a credo, the same way that a historian does, the same way that a lot of professions do, and so we should count on those professional ethics and standards to really be part of it. They're not always, but that is one thing that keeps uh, legacy media different than the other kinds we're going to kind of briefly talk about here, right? Which are less tethered to those journalistic standards, right? So we've got kind of what we would call maybe alternative or independent sources of news, and then social media, which is totally off the rails in a way. What's independent news, Josh?
Yeah, I mean, I guess technically we're probably the smallest fish in the pond of that category. Um,
Hey,
but
we get 20 views, whatever.
we've crossed the 20 view threshold on all of our
Oh,
videos.
okay.
Um, I mean, it's independent media it's more reliant on the internet and the transmission of videos over YouTube. Um, it's podcasting basically. I'd say
Sure.
is the
Yeah.
main venue in which this kind of media unfolds. The usual suspects on the right wing are going to be Joe Rogan at the top, although he probably wouldn't call himself right wing, but he is. Your Ben Shapiro's, your Jordan Petersons, your Charlie Kirks, your Dave Rubins. There's the crunchy to alt right pipeline, which gives you people like Russell Brand.
Oh, yeah.
Um, just all winners, right? Well, and it's kind of like a double-edged sword, right? Because you also are not beholden to the corporate stakeholders that dictate, you know,
Right.
what you can and cannot say with a mainstream news outlet. So you
Yeah.
are more free to say things that aren't tethered to an overarching agenda. But
You're also
in
less corrupted by profits, in theory,
in
unless you're at the
theory,
very
yeah.
top of the podcast world.
Or unless you're Tim Pool and unwittingly take 100 grand an episode from the Russians. But I mean, he was a victim though. He was a victim, and that's all I'll say about that. Uh, I mean, I think the takeaway here that we want to just make quickly is like there's a certain level of ignorance that comes out from a lot of these news outlets independently because they don't have to hold themselves to those same journalistic standards that the mainstream outlets do.
Yeah.
Um, you can, and certain outlets do, and there's an abundance of very credible and very important independent and alternative media sources that I rely on, that I'm sure a lot of people rely on. Um, and it presents a breath of fresh air in a way. The person that comes to mind for me is actually not political at all, but it's the Pat McAfee show for
Oh yeah,
sports.
yeah.
The
He's a
Indianapolis
great
Colts.
example of this. Yeah,
Yes, and it's just like there's a certain way you're kind of expected to conduct yourself as a journalist on an MSNBC or CNN or whatever.
I'm a Kirk Herbstreit fan, right?
Okay,
And I
yeah,
like buttoned up Kirk Herbstreit with his dog, his golden retriever,
yeah,
predictably, right? And Pat McAfee drives me nuts, right?
right, exactly.
But you love Pat
I
McAfee
love Pat
because he
McAfee.
doesn't act like Kirk Herbstreit.
Yeah, yeah, and I think, I mean,
But the two of them together are golden, right? And so
yes,
this, yes,
um, and Pat McAfee's success has been so great that he's now kind of being incorporated into the.
into the media
It's almost
world,
like how
yes.
hegemony works in a way, but that's a separate conversation. But even Pat McAfee, I've said this before about myself as a Minnesota Vikings fan. Um, Pat McAfee smartly, I guess, knew that if he brought Aaron Rodgers, who's we know has been immunized from COVID, if he brought Aaron Rodgers onto his podcast every week, the throngs would tune in to either love him or hate him. And
Yeah.
uh, I love Pat McAfee, but there's a certain level of malfeasance I think you attribute to him, and letting Aaron Rodgers have that platform to spew all level of football related and non football related bullshit. So I just think like I said, it's a real double edged sword where you have greater freedoms, but
Yes.
like
But
the
you,
level of ignorance that possibly takes over those conversations is very real.
right. And you have a certain responsibility being in control of this very broad platform, right? Like I'm thinking of the Joe Rogan podcast. Um, if you bring on a Holocaust denier, that's on you as much as it's on them, right? Because you're going to have all those listeners hear that nonsense about how Winston Churchill is the villain of World War II, and and whether you wanted to or not, you're now spewing that on your platform, right? And so um, that's the danger, right? That there's this elevation of ignorance or elevation of lack of expertise um, from someone who's just a host, right? And
Right. He's just asking questions.
that's right. Yeah,
Right. That's
yeah,
all he does.
that's right.
Um,
Uh, and yet, at the same time, right? If you critique the podcast or you critique these independent alternative news medias, you run the risk of looking like you're cracking down on free speech, which is the real double-edged sword of this too. Is that how do you criticize a alternative podcast or news outlet without sounding like you're trying to censor them? And that's a real problem that in a democracy we've had various answers to over time. And I don't think we have a good answer for it.
well, the answer is media literacy. Implementing that is
Yes.
easier
Okay.
said than done. I mean, there are other countries that are introducing kind of public school coursework to teach that, which I think is a good thing, but that ain't going to happen anytime in the U.S. I can say that much.
That sounds like a lesson in civics, Josh.
Yeah, yeah, I guess civics in the 21st century.
Uh-huh.
What
Well,
a
it ain't
ride.
dead. That's all I know.
Yeah, 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 yeah.
Not yet.
Speaking of things that we wish were dead, we should probably spend a little time talking about social media.
Yeah, we should. Yeah.
Um, Yikes.
Yikes. This could be its own episode, folks. So we're not going to cover everything. But the problem with social media, and here I'm thinking about Facebook mostly, but also Twitter/X/Truth Social and all the alternatives to that. The problem here is everyone's voice is equal. And I know that makes me sound elitist, but it means everyone is a potential publisher, right? Everyone is potentially publishing what someone else might consume as news, right? Without journalistic, parameters, without any kind of adherence to responsibility, right? So you could just post a rant on Facebook, think nothing of it ever again. But if other people read that and circulate it, or circulate it as news, which is the worst case scenario, all of a sudden your little rant turns into a factoid that influences the way someone else thinks. Um, and that's the big, I guess, pitfall of these social media type ways of consuming news, which apparently is now what most Americans do.
Yeah, which is terrifying. I mean, it's again, it's the democratization of information dissemination. I guess
Yes.
that's a mouthful, but you were speaking of the responsibility someone like Joe Rogan or Pat McAfee has and the guests they bring on. Well, it's like on social media, everyone's got
Everyone,
everyone is
yes.
responsible for what they say or what they post or what they write. I mean, you are the author and you have to own it, right? And
Yeah.
I mean, obviously it's like glib to say, but like you said, you are a publisher, and it's really the line becomes completely blurred between what is journalism and what is a kind of a false sense of reality with no basis in facts.
Yeah.
That blurred line becomes most clearly seen with social media, I think, which is
Hmm.
why it's so terrifying. Uh, because people just post stuff or they get into these rabbit holes of content that are not based at all in even conversations. They're just memes or they're
Yeah.
snippets of a statement by someone that may or
Right.
may not be grammatically correct. Um, so it's not even really news. It's just like images and phrases and
And they're emotionally tied, right? So
yes,
whether it's a news clip or a X post from Trump or an AI image of Trump making Gaza great again or whatever, right? Or the classic, Pope Trump the first. Those AI images. That's just one example, right, of this kind of distortion of reality. And of course, even as you're consuming them, you're going to know half this stuff isn't real. But that is almost the point, right? You're in your echo chamber and you don't want to come out of it, right? Um, and the social media platforms are set up this way, which is part of the problem. Again, a profit-driven model in which algorithms feed these echo chambers. So if I click on one post about undocumented immigrants in my home state of Ohio, it might lead me to another post about rumors about undocumented immigrants. And before you know it, I'm Dumbo JD Vance reading about cats eating or Asians eating cats in Springfield, Ohio, and not vetting any of that information. It's just some lady posted it, and now JD Vance is spewing it on national television. Um,
yeah, and then Trump is spewing it in a
in a
national debate,
debate,
right?
yes, yeah.
And I mean, honestly, do you would think he's just saying it because he knows how to get a rise out of people? The way he responded in the debate almost gave me the sense he thought it was true.
I think he probably thought it was true.
Uh,
Which
yeah,
tells us other things about mental capacities, but that's a different episode um,
yeah,
where we talk about Sleepy Biden and Sleepy Donald and all
yeah,
that good
yeah.
stuff.
That's coming. Yeah,
Um, but the point here is, right, you can't trust what you see on social media, and like I think that's got to be the takeaway for social media news consumption, because not only is there just like random stuff circulating, there's also bots. Like, we know this, right? There is active disinformation going on. It's deliberate. So you've got the ignorant side of it, but you also have the deliberate side. We know Russian bots are a thing on Facebook. We know, that some X users are not real people, right? They're just some kind of chat bot that is set up by um, bad actors, whether it's bad state actors from abroad or bad actors that just want to cause chaos at home. Either way, right? some of the things that you're interacting with on social media are not real people, and you cannot trust those sources. Um,
Yeah, and this is a real, again, it's a political issue because a lot of Republicans will say that these claims are conspiratorial. A lot of Republicans are skeptical of these warnings about foreign disinformation campaigns,
sure,
right? Saying it's either overblown or it's just like Democrats demonizing political views they disagree with.
right.
Um, I mean, like what I would say to that is like, nope, they're real. Like for it to be a conspiracy, you'd have to have no proof. We've got the proof, um, and it's not like recent. Like this goes back almost. Well, the troll factor goes back to 2013, right?
Right.
In St. Petersburg, right? It's called the Internet Research Agency, um, out of St. Petersburg, right? And this is like the center of the DOJ criminal indictment on election interference for the
Right.
2016 election. Um, uh, but it's like thousands and thousands of accounts on Twitter at the time, Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, like actively spreading misinformation and disinformation, mostly about Russian stuff with Ukraine, but as to call back to our foreign policy episode way back when, Russia's got a real plan to destabilize the U.S. and the West through kind of inflaming culture war
Internal. That's right. Yeah.
rhetoric within the U.S. So it's not just about Ukraine, but it is largely about Ukraine. Just to give one example, just to like put a pin in this with some proof, you might recall several U.S. senators, but J.D. Vance being the most notable now that he's VP, peddling the story about Zelensky purchasing 2 yachts for like 75 million, with the obvious implication being, well, why are we going to fund Ukraine, who has a history of corruption, if the president is just going to buy himself 2 luxury yachts? I mean, first of all, it's not true. He doesn't own any yachts, right? Like that's the baseline we have to establish. It's made up. But the story came out of a publication called DC Weekly, which ostensibly is run out of Washington, D.C. Uh, so the BBC, who's very respected, right? They ran this story down. This is from a couple years ago, although JD has brought it up
Continued to
recently
bring
at
it up. Yeah.
the Oval Office meeting, right, with Zelensky. Um, so DC Weekly was founded by this disaffected U.S. Marine from Florida who moved to, what country do you think he moved to?
I don't know. Russia.
Yeah, so he's in Moscow, and there's a server there that runs DC Weekly out of Moscow. Um, they have fake journalists with fake photos, and then they basically take copies of stories from other news outlets and filter them through AI generators to reproduce the language in a different way. And a lot of it's part of this larger pro-Russia propaganda machine, which is well documented in with Putin. Like we
Yeah.
know this, we know he's done this for 25 years at least now. But again, like it starts with an obscure YouTube channel of like a couple of viewers, no bigger than us. Gets picked up by DC Weekly, which is run out of Moscow,
Right.
and before you know it, the vice president of the United States
Is
is
parroting this. Yeah.
trying to convince U.S. congressmen to not fund Ukraine because of this story. And that's one. That's one of many. You could say just coming from DC Weekly, and that's just one publication. I mean, there's a whole uh, documented history to track down of Russian propaganda tactics and their very real news outlets, if you can even call them that. That their main goal is to keep their own population, drinking the Kool-Aid, but there are real geopolitical benefits for Russia destabilizing the U.S. and we're experiencing that
Yeah.
from freaking Oval Office,
That's a
right?
great example. Yeah. That's good. It's good detail, Josh. Well, and that's what gets us, I guess, kind of to the end here, right? That, okay, so we're in these silos of news consumption legacy media, right? You're either watching Fox News and Newsmax over here, or you're watching CNN, or maybe you're watching MSNBC. You tune into your favorite podcast, which may or may not bring on someone ignorant, dangerous, ridiculous, whatever, and then you open up your feed, right? And I scroll through reels that I'm algorithmically selected to see, or that my friends who think like me send to me, right? And that's my news consumption. And that's why we end up in this 2025 moment where we are so diametrically opposed. I mean, I had an argument recently with a family member about these riots, so-called riots, protests, ICE raids, and all of the above, right? And the conclusion we came to at the end of the argument is, well, I watch very different news outlets than you do. And I was like, yeah, exactly. That's the problem, right? And I don't know, media literacy is definitely part of it. Like, doggone common sense and critical thinking is part of it too. Not giving into your emotions, not giving into your worst angels. But, I don't know how you move past this very divisive, different reality that we live in now, where half the country thinks LA burned to the ground last week, and half of it thinks that LA looks lovely. And we're tuning in from there with you tonight, right? So I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's again, this is we can say this till we're blue in the face, but it's just like a civic responsibility of everyone to call out lies or falsehoods when you come across them.
Yeah.
Like if we're not going to get to a point where there's censorship of any of these media outlets, and that would be a bad thing. And you have to be able to defend
Yeah.
even the most vile falsehoods being spread. If public health is on the line, that's a different conversation for a different day. But generally speaking, we need to defend Fox News's right to lie to our faces, and that's part of
And
what it means to be in a free society, right?
and then count on that free society to filter things as necessary. Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Which I guess goes back to that judge's decision, right? That we've got to count on American people to have some kind of civic common sense at the end of the day. In how they
We definitely
consume
shouldn't
news.
defund education.
That would be
That
a
wouldn't
bad thing.
help.
Yes. That's right. Well, good. This has been a good conversation. I know it's been a long one, but lots of good stuff to cover. So, good stuff. We're in almost into the height of summer. We're gonna do one more episode before we take a short hiatus, and that episode actually ties in well here, Josh, because we're gonna talk about how to stay sane. How to stay sane and responsibly consume all of this media waves, all of these media waves that keep hitting us, right? So how do you do it? How do you balance, your time of staying engaged and being civically responsible with also being a human that doesn't have to think about a 24-hour news cycle 24 hours a day. So we won't necessarily talk about the news, but Josh and I are going to spitball how we try to stay sane and keep the blood pressure down, especially over the summertime here. So I don't know. Hopefully you have some killer solutions because I got none. I'm afraid.
Well, I mean, taking the cue from our president, like if you're trying to keep the blood pressure down, one way to do that is not go to the doctor and find out what your blood pressure is.
Hey,
It's been a while. It's been a while for me, so I don't
my
want to know.
MO. Yeah, it's my MO.
Yeah, I should probably take some time and go to the doctor. Or not. I don't know.
If you take some ivermectin at home, maybe you'll be fine. It's too close to the topic. Anyway, we're gonna end on that note. We're gonna stay sane till next time. Thanks for tuning in, anyone who did.
Yeah. Yes.
Stay civically engaged. See you next time, Josh.
Cheers.